Good morning, everybody. Welcome in. We are so excited to have you here this morning for this awesome presentation. I am just going to give everybody a few moments to get situated, grab a cup of coffee, whatever you're feeling this morning. So I will call you all back in about 3 minutes, and that's when we will begin this amazing presentation. But for now, just get situated while we let people in, and we'll go from there. For those of you just coming in, we're just giving everybody another minute to get situated, and then we will start the presentation. All right, I think we should be good to go. Again, thank you so much for coming to this awesome presentation this morning. Today we are going to be presenting on the topic purple teaming with MITRE ATT&CK in the oil and gas sector. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. And well, yeah, first off, I just want to say a huge thank you to wherever you are today, taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us on this interesting talk on MuddyWater and OilRig, or otherwise known as APT34. So with me today, we'll just do a quick introduction. So I've got my colleague Francis with me. We're your presenters today. So my name is Andrew Costis. I'm a senior cyber threat consultant at ATT&CK. I've been with the company since around last April time, and my day job primarily consists of working very closely with global enterprise customers, helping them to implement the ATT&CK security optimization platform, obviously helping them to test and validate their security controls, as well as operationalize the MITRE ATT&CK framework and implement purple teaming. Prior to joining ATT&CK, I worked as a threat researcher and malware analyst for around 5 years, working specifically in the e-crime sector, looking at numerous ransomware campaigns and so on. So that's a little bit about me. I hand over to Francis to introduce himself.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. My name is Francis Gibernau. I'm an adversary research engineer here in ATT&CK, and I'm also the cyber threat intelligence project leader. My duties here in ATT&CK are the identification, analysis, documentation, and emulation of the activities carried out by advanced persistent threats and e-crime groups. I have experience on vulnerability assessment and management, and I was also part of a security operations team a while back. Handing to you back, Andrew.
Cool, thanks, Francis. Yeah, interesting background, I like it. So without further ado, we're going to kind of break this presentation down into really two sections. So I'm going to start off talking about MuddyWater and the content that's associated with it, and then I'm going to dive into a quick demo, and then Francis will be talking specifically about OilRig. So without further ado, let's start with MuddyWater. So who are MuddyWater? So essentially they are an adversary thought to be of Iranian origin. They were actually discovered by Palo Alto Networks some time ago, probably around 2017, possibly earlier. Now, There's some other names that you may have come across that are also linked to MuddyWater, which is Static Kitten, Mercury, Cobalt Ulster, and the other ones listed there. The motivation behind MuddyWater is political, and the sophistication level is referred as expert. And that's basically because MuddyWater have been known to use custom malware as well as exploit publicly known vulnerabilities. So the adversary, which is thought to be a subordinate to the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, have primarily targeted nations in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Iraq and Pakistan, but that also includes other regions across North America, Europe, Asia and Africa. So the main sectors targeted by this particular adversary are energy, resources and utilities, government, as well as telecommunications, but that's not necessarily constrained to those sectors. There has been known at times to be other sectors targeted too. So additionally, MuddyWater makes use of malware sets to load malware, gain access through backdoors, gain and maintain persistence, and achieve data exfiltration, as well as using open source tools. Now, before diving into the demo portion, as I said, there's an aspect to what we're talking about today, which is the content that gets released into the ATT&CK platform. And this content for MuddyWater actually translates into 2 assessment templates. So this first assessment template is for the Operation Quicksand, which is a campaign specifically taken part by MuddyWater. Now, it's unknown what sectors were targeted, but generally speaking, Operation Quicksand was known to carry out destructive behaviors, such as with the use of wipers, which were actually masquerading as ransomware, probably for financially motivated reasons. Now, it's not, as I say, it's not particularly clear which sectors were targeted, but there is evidence that points to the Middle East as the main target for this particular operation. Operation Quicksand, in fact, has 2 primary attack vectors. The first vector, which was known to be carried out, was used to send malicious documents that were executed, which subsequently called back to a C2 server, which then downloaded files and then later deployed the PalGoop loader. And the second vector includes exploiting vulnerabilities such as the Microsoft Exchange remote code execution vulnerability, the net logon elevation of privilege, or the zero logon vulnerability. So in other words, at a higher level, the attack graph shown here, or this assessment template shown here, that we released focuses on the first vector, which, as I mentioned, uses social engineering efforts and avoids a malicious Excel document in order to gain the initial foothold. And just as a quick summary, this attack graph starts off with the initial access and C2 callback. We then have the execution, credential dumping, discovery, and persistent steps. And then towards the end of the attack chain, we have the actual PalGoop loader, which is a fake signed Google update mechanism, which was deployed during this campaign using DLL sideloading techniques. The second assessment template for MuddyWater comes in the form of the MuddyWater intrusion set. So this intrusion set contains a collection of TTPs used in 4 of the MuddyWater campaigns that are known to have been carried out. Those campaigns were known to have targeted the telecom sector in the Middle East and Asia, as well as organizations in the Middle East in Operation Earth Vitala, also against the UAE and Kuwaiti government agencies, and finally against the Israeli organizations within Operation Quicksand, as I mentioned already. So the techniques included in this intrusion set are aligned to their corresponding MITRE attack tactic. And as MITRE states, you can think of each tactic to represent essentially the why of a given technique or sub-technique in fact occurs. So in other words, these are the tactical goals used by MuddyWater in each of these 4 campaigns. Now, the intrusion set contains the PowerStat sample, amongst other techniques, which is a highly obfuscated backdoor used by MuddyWater. The sample was reportedly to have used random proxies in order to avoid tracking, as well as enable communication between the compromised hosts back to the adversary's infrastructure. And just a final note, just want to really just give a special thanks to Clear Skies SEC and also CISA for providing the public intelligence, which without companies out there making that intelligence public, we would not be able to push out great content such as this. So without further ado, that's enough of the slide element. I'm going to now dive into the demo portion where I'll be talking about each of these two assessment templates in a bit more detail. All right, so for any ATT&CK customer, whenever we push out an assessment template, just like any other content, if you were to come into the assessments page and just do a simple search for MuddyWater, for example, and you'll see both of the two assessment templates that I've mentioned. So this first one is the attack graph, and if we click into the details, we'll see just a brief description around what the attack graph is, as well as the reports contained within it. And similarly for the MuddyWater intrusion set, we have again just a brief description, all of the different scenarios aligned to MITRE techniques and sub-techniques, broken down into test cases, as I mentioned, by the tactical layer, as well as the reports bundled within this particular attack graph. So starting with the attack graph itself, and just need to zoom in slightly, hopefully you should be able to see this. Okay, so starting with the attack graph, there's actually 16 nodes. So we always start at node 0 or step 0. And depending on how the adversary research team put these together, they can be essentially linear or fairly sequential, or they can be far more complex by using these if not prevented and if prevented branches to get a bit more advanced. Now, it's worth mentioning that for the MuddyWater attack graph to be successful in terms of when you run it, what you're going to need is an asset with an ATT&CK agent installed, and obviously that asset needs to be running. You don't need to do any configuration outside of this. So the only thing you need to allocate when running it is just the asset. Everything else is pre-populated for you within the attack graph, so you don't need to worry about changing any of the parameters or variables within each of these steps. It's also a good idea to have a standard user account or some user account assigned to the attack graph. So in other words, it should be executed as a non-system user. Now, as I mentioned before, part of the initial access is deploying the Office document. And for that reason, we do require that Microsoft Office or Microsoft Excel is installed on that particular asset that you want to run this attack graph against. You also need to ensure that the Excel process on that asset is not currently running on that target machine. And that's just to allow the best chances of the entire attack chain to play out. So we're just going to briefly walk across left to right some of these steps and just kind of talk about why we've included this content and what these steps actually mean. So starting at node 0, as I said, this is the malicious macro embedded within an Excel file, which was used by Operation Quicksand, and they would use this to install additional files for the first stage of the infection. The macro itself would also include things like ASCII and XOR and base64 encoding, and so that's how we try and emulate it there. The next step is the command execution. So essentially, once the macro is decoded from the Excel document, the PowerShell code is then downloaded, which in turn communicates out to a breach server from which the group downloads additional files for the second stage of the attack. Now that calling out to C2 is actually done by our step 2, which is the standard application layer protocol scenario. So this is the scenario which uses a non-standard port. In other words, on this occasion, it uses TCP 443, but over HTTP, not HTTPS, because that's how Operation Quicksand leveraged this technique. And we do that with a malicious payload to emulate the C2 behavior. And this is actually a really common technique. It's probably just worth mentioning, used by many threat actors to essentially blend in with normal network traffic. I'm just going to scroll over because there's quite a few to get to. So now looking at step number 3. So next we're going to emulate the credential dumping using the well-known credential dumping tool, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, otherwise known as Mimikatz. So this scenario will essentially attempt to extract all available NTLM hashes, as well as clear text passwords from memory of the LSAS process. Next, we have some discovery commands. So in order to enumerate the environment, we'll use commands, again, the same way that Quicksand does, for example, net user. And for the network system discovery commands, we'll even be using things like the built-in netstack command, to essentially look at locally established network connections and running services listening on that host, which would essentially provide additional situational awareness. So moving over again slightly, so now we're up to step 6. So for the persistence phase, essentially a benign file will be copied to the startup directories, such as the user's profile, start menu program, startup folder. When that's accomplished, a Windows scheduled task is generated by the attack. The next scenario will use the Windows binary known as rundll32 to essentially emulate the communication with the C2 over OpenSSL, which was used by Operation Quicksand. Next up, we have, again, the standard application layer protocol. So the C2 communication is used in the next phase of the attack, where it actually makes an outbound connection just over TCP port 80 using HTTP. The malware then generates a second scheduled task called updater. We then have some additional discovery commands, and these are typically quite common in a lot of targeted attacks and nation state type attacks. They typically like to use lots of living off the land binaries, and Operation Quicksand in this instance is no different. So for example, the typical kind of discovery commands will be any Windows, all of the common Windows command line utilities for things such as querying IP address information, enumerating network shares, displaying routing tables, ARP information, as well as domain controller information. So all of that is packaged up into that single step number 11. So next up, the PowerGoop malware sample is essentially downloaded to memory, and prior to it being installed on the system, I should probably add. And the PowerGoop malware is essentially a loader for a variant of the Thanos ransomware, which had previously been linked to the Hackbit ransomware family some time ago. So essentially the PowerGoop loader is comprised of a DLL loader and a PowerShell-based downloader. So once the PowerGoop is deployed, essentially the intent of this was to masquerade, as I mentioned before, as ransomware, but in fact what it actually did was carry out disk wiping activities by overwriting the master boot record. Now I can just to put everyone's mind at ease, we're not taking it to that level. So rest assured, we're not going to be wiping your master boot record. We're essentially just testing your network devices. And then in step number 12, we're essentially testing your endpoint device or security sensor by making sure that the sample is actually captured and alerted on and hopefully blocked when it's written to disk. So that's the step number 13, writing it to the file system. So similar, but we're actually testing a different security control here. So once the malware is essentially on disk, the malware will then essentially become deployed, and a WMIC command is run in order to delete a backdoor that was essentially hiding, that was used to kind of communicate between infected hosts on the network. And the final scenario, which is the DLL sideloading technique. So we use this basically to emulate the sideloading technique used by the PowerGoop loader. So essentially what this means is, so once the legitimate Google Update executable loads the legitimate DLL into memory, it in turn loads the malicious DLL into memory, and that is what's known as sideloading. and that's why we've used the technique in here, because that was quite a big part of that particular malware. And as I said, the actual DLL itself was a signed Google Update file, and so would typically evade a lot of security controls on the endpoint. Okay, so that's the attack graph. Now I'm going to jump over and just very briefly talk about the intrusion set. So as I mentioned, the intrusion set is just a collection, if you like, of the various techniques used in the 4 campaigns that I mentioned earlier. So as I mentioned, we include the PowerStats malware, which is the highly obfuscated backdoor used by MuddyWater, and a bunch of other things. So again, before we kind of dive into some of these, I just want to briefly mention, in fact, I've just realized that I'm going to change that to higher number so you can actually see the remaining ones. That's better. So before we actually dive into some of these tactics and techniques, I just want to mention again, just real quick, just the prereqs to this. So again, like with any assessment, you would need to have an asset with an attack IQ agent installed, and it obviously needs to be active as well in order to run this. Again, there is very little configuration required in terms of the assessment. You really just need to decide what asset or assets you want to run it against, and whether you want to run it on a schedule or on demand, and away you go. Again, all of the techniques are kind of pre-built, so there should be very minimal configuration, unless of course there is any particular customization that you want to perform. So similarly, like the Operation Quicksand attack graph, because this technique, because this intrusion set uses parts, or pretty much most of the techniques that I showed you in the Operation Quicksand attack graph, it's a good idea to have Microsoft Excel again installed on the asset that you want to test, and again to make sure that the Excel process is not running on that target asset. It's also a good idea to have a privileged domain user account assigned to the attack graph. So again, it should not be executed as a non-system user. And that's really just for the ATT&CK attack scenario, which essentially will attempt to use the Kerberos service account KRB TGT to dump the hashes from the domain. So in other words, if no account is specified, then you will probably see a requirements not met message when you run the ATT&CK attack. Alternatively, you could just drop that particular scenario if that's not something that you want to necessarily run, or maybe you don't have the rights to do that. So with that out the way, I'm going to jump into a couple of these. I'm not going to jump through all of them because there's just too many techniques, but we'll start off with, let's say, discovery. So we can click on any of these particular test cases. And as I said earlier, they're all labeled by the tactic aligned to the MITRE attack matrix. So this should all be fairly familiar terminology here. But we can click the 3 dots and then click on manage scenarios. And then within this, we see each of the techniques used across those 4 campaigns by MuddyWater. So again, really common techniques by a lot of threat actors, but again, these are tailored to the various 4 campaigns that I talked about before. So, you know, typically using living off the land binaries such as WMI, again, using ipconfig, netstat, netuser, and various other types of discovery scripts that are designed to emulate this particular adversary. And again, if we jump into just picking defense evasion, so we've got 6 scenarios in here. And again, a lot of this aligns to kind of living off the land. So really common, but some of these techniques are really common, but again, they're quite specific to MuddyWater. So we've obviously mentioned about the DLL side loading. Obviously, there's a lot of obfuscation and encoded files as used as part of the different stages of the malware. So again, I mentioned before base64 and XOR and so on. So we have techniques and scenarios to emulate that. Again, we have masquerading, we have regserve32, rundll32. These are Windows binaries that come shipped with any Windows operating system for as far back as I can remember. And again, a privilege escalation technique known as bypass user account control, or UAC, is also bundled into this. So these are quite common techniques, but in some environments could be very easily missed and fly under the radar, just because of the fact that they like to live off the land, and by doing so doesn't necessarily produce as much noise. So I'm not going to jump into every single test case because I don't want to hog too much time, but just one final point I wanted to mention. So obviously the attack graph focuses specifically on Operation Quicksand, and then we have this intrusion set that particularly refers to Operation Quicksand and the 3 other campaigns. But it's really a good idea to actually review the intrusion set, and perhaps even using the attack graph, you might be able to create your own custom attack graph, because just because this is the content that we've pushed out doesn't necessarily mean that you might not have your own sightings or observations. Perhaps you're tracking an undiscovered campaign that isn't mentioned in this particular intrusion set, but maybe there's some overlap between some of these test cases and techniques versus what your CTI team are observing in the wild, for example. So these are just showing you how we've done it, but there is absolutely nothing to stop you coming into the attack graph and either using a subset of the intrusion set techniques or even creating your own custom scenarios and then building out your own custom branching to represent not just necessarily MuddyWater, but also any other threat actor as well. And with that, I'm done with my talking, so I'm going to hand over to Francis and I'm going to let him talk about OilRig. So over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Andrew. All right. Can you send me the share screen permission?
Oh, yeah, sure. For some reason it didn't do it. There we go.
All right. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So today I'll be presenting on the adversary known as OilRig, also known as APT34, so you can know it by both names. In order to explain a little bit of the content that we released a while back, it is important for me to give a little bit of a background into the threat actor. So in this case, OilRig is an Iranian adversary, a state-sponsored, politically motivated Iranian adversary that was first identified by ATT&CK in 2012 during a wave of destructive attacks against Middle East. These attacks were known as the Shamoon attacks, and they later had a second stage some years ago in the second step of the Shamoon attacks. The group was named and recognized as a unique adversary by Palo Alto Networks in 2016, but also has more aliases known, such as Helix Kitten, Cobalt Gypsy, Cobalt MuddyWater, DNS Espionage, and so on. As I previously explained, the motivation of the threat actor is political, so security vendors have observed the threat actor to be aligned with the interest of the Iranian government, and it's also its motivation to sabotage other organizations that compete against Iran. OilRig's victims have primarily spanned the government, financial services, energy resources and utilities, manufacturing, telecommunications, and technology industries, and has targeted regions such as Middle East, North America, and Africa, and as well as many countries in the Middle East. OilRig has shown a big proficiency in a wide range of attack vectors. OilRig primarily executes socially engineered attacks throughout the use of legitimate social networks such as LinkedIn. It also has led destructive attacks against many organizations around the world throughout the use of wipers, and it also performs supply chain compromise, where the threat actor exploited relationships of trust between organizations in order to reach their desired targets. This final type of attack, the supply chain compromises, is what grants the OilRig the status of innovator, which means that the threat actor is capable of executing attacks against organizations via supply chain attacks. It also means that the threat actor is capable of performing and exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, and so on. In the last weeks, we published 2 new attack graphs that seek to emulate 2 different activities carried out by this adversary throughout the years. The first one is known as the Quad Agent campaign. This happened in July 2018. And the first steps of this campaign goes after the download and execution of the Quad Agent sample. Quad Agent is a powerful PowerShell-based backdoor with the ability to communicate with its command and control server by using protocols such as HTTPS, HTTP, and DNS. and each of these being a fallback for the previous one. In this case, we can observe that the first steps are the execution of the malware, then achieving persistence throughout the use of scheduled tasks. After that, we created a specific scenario in which a PowerShell script is used to set up a registry key value in which information is going to be stored. And after that, the C2 communication is initiated. In this case, step 4 is the HTTPS. In this case, if this one fails or if it is prevented, it's going to jump into step 6, HTTP. And if step 6 is prevented, it's going to jump into the DNS lookup. In this case, step 8 is the DNS initiate, and the step 10 is the DNS goodbye. After this, it starts the discovery and exfiltration phase of the attack. In this case, the threat actor aims to discover domain and forest trusts of the system, which means it starts to wonder opportunities for lateral movement. After this, it collects information about the owner and the user of the system. And this data is finally exfiltrated over HTTP, or in this case, once again, as a fallback channel, the DNS record can be used. After this, in step 11, the deobfuscation script is used to deobfuscate a piece of configuration, which is going to contain the information for the secondary communication method that is going to be used by the end stage of the attack graph, which is this one. And finally, once again, is going to be the fallback channels using HTTPS, HTTP, and DNS. At the end of this attack graph, we have the opportunity to expand it since it is reported that the adversary is capable of receiving a PowerShell script that is going to be executed on the system after these final last communications. In this case, in the same way of MuddyWater, we are going to be releasing in the upcoming weeks an OilRig intrusion set assessment template where all the techniques and procedures used by this adversary are going to be contemplated, not just the ones used in the quad agent campaign and the next campaign that I'm going to showcase. In these ways, we believe that the assessment can be executed in order to test the security controls against all OilRig capabilities. It is worth mentioning that this quad agent campaign was used to target the government and technology sectors in Middle East. The results, as we can see, are 2/3 are prevented in over 11 different security controls that we tested on, while 1/3 is not prevented and the full kill chain can be executed. Also, it is worth mentioning that the detection is basically the same. So 2/3 of the 11 assets that we used are capable of detecting this activity, while 36% didn't recognize the activity being executed on the system. In the second attack graph, this attack graph emulates the activity reported by Mandian and Intesar a while back. It describes a series of phishing attacks carried out throughout the social networks known as LinkedIn. This case happened in January 2020 during the first 3 months that we have prior to the pandemic. And the first stages starts with the deobfuscation of a configuration file that is arrived into the system. This configuration file is capable of downloading and executing the tone deaf sample, which is the sample used to achieve persistence by OilRig. In this case, the persistence is achieved throughout the use of scheduled tasks, similar to the previous quad agent campaigns task. After that, the step 4 is initial check-in web request, a specific scenario made to emulate the communications used by tone deaf. So in this case, we are seeing the execution, the persistent, and C2 communications perform into the system, so the 3 first tactics of the threat actor. After that, we arrive to the discovery and exfiltration phase, in which the adversary collects basic information about the system. It then collects information about the owner and the user, such as the hostname and username, and all this data is later staged into a specific file for later exfiltration over HTTP. After that, a series of samples are then downloaded into the system. The first one being the long watch, which is going to collect additional information on the system, is going to perform reconnaissance that is later going to be staged. After that, it is executed value vault. In case value vault, which is a credential stealer, is prevented from being executed on the system, the threat actor is going to be using the pickpocket sample. Pickpocket is going to be also a credential stealer that is going to be mainly focused in collecting browser credentials rather than operating system credentials. And even if one branch or the other is successfully executed, this data is going to be also staged and finally exfiltrated over HTTP, or in case this is prevented, it's going to be used over the fallback channel, which is the DNS-A record. This attack is worth mentioning that was aimed against the energy, resources, and utilities sector, as well as professional services and government sectors in Middle East and North America. Jumping into the conclusions, the overall prevention was 90% not prevented. So this means that 11 security controls which we tested were not capable of preventing the kill chain from being executed, while the overall detection was similar to the previous quad agent campaign, in which 64% were able to detect this activity but not prevent it, and 36% were not able to detect this activity. With that being said, I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. If there are any questions, we're going to be expecting them into the chat. And with that, I say goodbye and thank you for attending this seminar.